August 4th, 1944, 23:50 hours. Prisoner of war camp number 12. Cowra, New South Wales, Australia. Sergeant Major Kanazawa Hajime lay on his thin mattress, the coarse wool blanket scratching at his chin. His eyes were wide open in the dark, fixed on the corrugated iron ceiling of Hut B. Outside, the Australian winter night was still, the air crisp and cold, a stark contrast to the suffocating humidity of the New Guinea jungle where his war had ended. The only sounds were the soft breathing of the other men in the hut and the distant rhythmic crunch of gravel under the boots of a lone sentry. He should have been dead. 3 months ago, a burst from an Owen gun had torn through his left leg. He remembered the searing heat, the coppery taste of blood in his mouth, and the strange sense of peace as he lost consciousness, expecting to awaken in the afterlife. His duty done, his honor intact. Instead, he had awoken here. He had woken up in a clean bed, his leg expertly bandaged, to the face of a smiling Australian doctor who had offered him a cigarette. It was the first of many profound and deeply unsettling kindnesses. His hand instinctively went to the scarred, tight skin on his thigh. The surgeons had saved the leg. They had used something called penicillin, an almost magical substance that had erased the raging infection that should have killed him. They had given him food, clean clothes, and a bed. They had treated him not as a disgraced enemy, but as a patient. In his mind, it was a violation. It was a methodical and compassionate dismantling of everything he had ever been taught. The Emperor's soldiers did not surrender. They did not become prisoners. They fought until death, and in death they found their purpose. To be captured was a stain on one's family, a betrayal of the homeland. To then be nursed back to health by the enemy. That was a psychological torment he could not articulate. He could still feel the phantom weight of his gun-toe sword at his side, the familiar comfort of the silk-wrapped hilt. He had failed it. He had failed his men. He had failed the Emperor. Tonight, the whispers had been different. Not the usual hushed talk of home, of cherry blossoms, or of the meager camp rations. Tonight, the air was electric with a terrible, resolute purpose. Sergeant Major Kanazawa knew what was coming. The bugle call would sound soon. In the sterile, ordered world the Australians had built for them, a world of medicine and relative comfort, the men had decided to finally find the warrior's death they had been denied. The care they had received had not pacified them. It had only sharpened their shame, making the final, desperate act of annihilation inevitable. He was not afraid of death. He was afraid he had forgotten how to die with honor. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold at Cowra, one must first understand the place itself. Prisoner of war and internment group camp number 12 was a sprawling, 30-hectare complex situated in the rolling countryside of New South Wales. It was a city of wire and wood, designed with cold military efficiency. The camp was divided into 4 separate compounds, A, B, C, and D, each surrounded by triple-coiled Dannert barbed wire fences, nearly 3 meters high. Between the compounds ran a central road, grimly nicknamed Broadway by the guards. Watchtowers, equipped with Vickers and Lewis machine guns, punctuated the perimeter, their fields of fire overlapping to create an inescapable killing ground. By August 1944, the camp's primary occupants were over 2,000 Japanese prisoners of war, captured across the Pacific Theater, from the jungles of New Guinea to the coral atolls of the Solomon Islands. There were also Italian POWs and civilian internees, but they were housed separately and lived in a different reality. The Australian contingent guarding this volatile population was shockingly small. The 22nd Garrison Battalion was composed largely of older men, veterans of the First World War, or young soldiers deemed medically unfit for frontline combat. They were competent guards, but they were not an elite combat unit. They were outnumbered more than 4 to 1. Their primary arsenal consisted of standard-issue Lee Enfield rifles, a handful of Owen submachine guns, and the aforementioned Vickers and Lewis guns in the towers, weapons intended for containment, not for repelling a massed, suicidal charge. The camp's administration operated under the strict guidelines of the 1929 Geneva Convention. This was not a matter of choice. It was Allied policy. Prisoners were to be afforded protections, rights, and a standard of living equivalent to that of the detaining power's own depot troops. This meant a structured camp life. The Japanese prisoners organized themselves with rigid military discipline, maintaining their own command structure with officers and NCOs like Sergeant Major Kanazawa in charge. They were assigned tasks, from cooking and cleaning to tending vegetable gardens that supplemented their rations. Crucially, the convention mandated comprehensive medical care. The camp hospital was a source of both pride for the Australians and profound confusion for the Japanese. It was staffed by Australian Army Medical Corps personnel, including skilled surgeons and doctors. Compared to the field conditions from which the prisoners had come, it was a medical marvel. It had access to the latest medicines of the era, including the revolutionary antibiotic penicillin and sulfa drugs, which were instrumental in fighting the tropical diseases and grievous wound infections most prisoners arrived with. Surgeries were performed in sterile environments, diets were prescribed for recovery, and dental care was available. For the Australian command, providing this level of care was a moral and legal obligation. It was a demonstration of their civilized values in a war defined by barbarity. They saw it as a tool for maintaining order, believing that humane treatment would lead to compliance. They failed to comprehend that for their specific prisoners, this logic was inverted. Every life saved, every wound healed, was a mark of shame in a culture where the only honorable outcome of capture was death. For Private Matsuo Kenji, a 19-year-old farm boy from Kagoshima, life in Hut 14 was a waking nightmare of cognitive dissonance. He had been captured on Guadalcanal, semi-conscious from malaria, and with a bayonet wound in his shoulder. In his fevered state, he had begged the American medics to kill him. Instead, they had given him quinine and water. From there, he was shipped to Australia, a journey he barely remembered. At Cowra, his wound was cleaned and stitched by an Australian doctor with kind eyes and a gentle touch. The doctor showed him a photograph of his own son, a boy about Kenji's age who was flying bombers over Germany. The gesture was meant to build a human connection, but for Kenji it was deeply alienating. How could this man, whose son was fighting and perhaps dying, treat him, the enemy, with such care? It did not compute. It felt like a trick, a sophisticated form of mockery. Each day was a ritual of quiet humiliation. The morning roll call, where he had to answer his name to a foreign guard. The food, mutton stew, bread, oatmeal, which was plentiful and nourishing but tasted like ash in his mouth. He was healthier now than he had been for most of his time in the Imperial Japanese Army. His wound had healed into a neat pink scar. The malaria was gone. His body was recovering, but his spirit was rotting. He and his comrades rarely spoke of their capture. To do so was to relive the moment of ultimate failure. Instead, they spoke of death. It became an obsession. The gyokusai, the shattered jewel, was the glorious ideal of sacrificing one's life for the emperor. It was the noble path they had all been denied. In whispered conversations after lights out, the senior NCOs would remind them of the field service code. Do not be taken prisoner alive, but die and leave no ignominy behind. They were living in ignominy. By dawn, the chaos subsided. The bugle was silent. The fires smoldered, casting a pall of smoke over the camp. The immediate result was a staggering butcher's bill. 4 Australian guards were dead, including Privates Hardy and Jones. Another 4 were wounded. But the cost to the Japanese was immense. 231 prisoners were killed, either cut down by machine gun fire, killed in hand-to-hand fighting, or by suicide. Another 188 were wounded. It was the largest and bloodiest prisoner of war breakout of World War II. The irony was devastating. The Australians had spent months using modern medicine to save these men from the wounds and diseases of the battlefield. In a few short hours of self-inflicted violence, that effort was erased in a tide of blood. The prisoners had finally found the death they believed the medical care had stolen from them. In the gray light of morning, a profound and eerie silence settled over the wrecked compound. The smoke, the smell of cordite, and the sight of the dead laid out in neat rows created a scene of surreal horror. For the Australian guards, the primary emotion was shock. They were garrison troops, not frontline infantry. They had been thrust into a battle of an intensity they had never imagined, against an enemy with a mindset they could not comprehend. The night's events shattered their perception of the Japanese prisoners. The quiet, compliant men who tended gardens and played baseball had transformed into a fanatical horde. The guards' sense of security was gone, replaced by a lingering fear and a deep-seated confusion. Why would men who received good food, shelter, and expert medical care choose to do this? For the surviving Japanese prisoners, the psychological impact was even more complex. There was no sense of victory. They had failed. The plan had been for everyone to die, a collective gyokusai. But hundreds had survived. They were rounded up from the surrounding countryside over the next 9 days, exhausted, wounded, and deeply ashamed. They had attempted to reclaim their honor through a glorious death and had failed once again. Now they were not just prisoners. They were failed suicides. This double dishonor plunged many into a state of profound depression and apathy. Sergeant Major Kanazawa had been found near dawn, unconscious from blood loss, a deep gash in his side from a bayonet and a bullet wound in his shoulder. He awoke once again in the camp hospital. The same Australian doctor who had saved his leg months earlier was now tending to his new wounds. The doctor's face was no longer smiling. It was grim, tired, and etched with a sadness Kanazawa could not interpret. The cycle of shame was beginning anew. He had led the charge, seeking an honorable end, only to be saved again by the very people he was trying to force to kill him. The medical staff were perhaps the most demoralized. They were healers, trained to preserve life. They had worked diligently to nurse these men back to health, often forming cautious, professional relationships with their patients. The breakout felt like a personal and professional betrayal. They had seen their work, their months of care and compassion literally thrown back in their faces in a suicidal frenzy. The sterile, ordered world of the hospital ward, with its charts and medicines, seemed utterly powerless against the powerful nihilistic ideology that had driven the prisoners. The doctors and medics continued their work, patching up the wounded from the breakout. But the sense of purpose was gone. They were caught in an absurd cycle, saving the lives of men who were desperate to die. The very foundation of their mission, the belief in the sanctity of life, had been shaken to its core. In the immediate aftermath, the Australian military and government moved to control the narrative. A military court of inquiry was convened. Its findings largely exonerated the guards, concluding they had acted appropriately in the face of an unpredictable and fanatical mass attack. The official story emphasized the suicidal nature of the breakout, framing it as an inexplicable act of Japanese fanaticism rather than a failure of Allied policy or understanding. The dead Japanese prisoners were buried with military honors in a specially created cemetery near the town, a final act of adherence to the Geneva Convention that stood in stark contrast to the night of violence. The Cowra breakout sent shockwaves through the Allied command structure responsible for POWs. It was a brutal lesson in cultural psychology. The assumption that humane treatment would pacify a captured enemy was proven dangerously naive, at least when applied to the soldiers of Imperial Japan. Security at other camps holding Japanese prisoners was immediately tightened. More importantly, it forced a reluctant reevaluation of the enemy's mindset. Intelligence officers and propagandists began to understand that the no-surrender code was not mere rhetoric. It was a core belief that could drive men to actions that seemed, to the Western mind, completely irrational. The event had little impact on the broader strategic course of the war, which was being decided in the vast naval battles of the Pacific and the island-hopping campaigns, but it served as a dark microcosm of the larger cultural chasm between the combatants. It illustrated why the war in the Pacific was fought with such particular ferocity and why battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa would become such horrific grinds. The Allies were fighting an enemy who did not share their fundamental assumptions about war, life, and death. Today, the Cowra Japanese War Cemetery stands as a quiet, beautifully maintained memorial. It is the final resting place for the men who died in the breakout and other Japanese who died in Australia during the war. Over time, it has become a symbol of reconciliation between two former enemies. But it is also a somber monument to a profound and tragic misunderstanding. It is a testament to a moment in history when the best intentions of one culture, the compassionate, life-saving impulse embodied by Allied medical care, collided with the rigid, death-seeking ideology of another, with devastating consequences. The men who died at Cowra were not just casualties of war. They were casualties of a gap in understanding so wide that not even the universal human experiences of sickness and healing could bridge it. The medical care was the most potent symbol of this dishonor. When a fellow prisoner fell ill with appendicitis, he was rushed to the camp hospital. An Australian surgeon performed an appendectomy, and the man returned to the hut a week later, alive and recovering. He was not celebrated. He was pitied. He had been given another chance to live a life of shame. Kenji saw the way the recovered man would sit by himself, his eyes vacant. He was physically healed but spiritually broken. This Allied medicine was not a cure. It was a poison that kept the body alive while the soul withered. The Australians thought they were saving lives. The Japanese prisoners felt they were having their death stolen from in. And so a consensus began to form, silently at first, then in urgent whispers. If they could not die for the Emperor on the battlefield, they would find a battlefield here, in this quiet corner of Australia. They would force the enemy to grant them the warrior's death they craved. The Australian command at Cowra, led by Major Edward Ramsay, operated under a set of assumptions rooted in a Western understanding of warfare and human psychology. They viewed their prisoners through the lens of their experience with German and Italian POWs from the First World War and the current conflict. For Europeans, while capture was undesirable, it was an accepted outcome of battle. A captured soldier's duty was to survive, not to seek death. Escape was the primary ambition, seen as a continuation of the fight. Australian intelligence reports and camp communications consistently highlighted the risk of escape attempts. Security protocols, guard rosters, and the very design of the camp were all geared towards preventing a breakout in the conventional sense. Small groups of men stealthily cutting wire and trying to melt into the countryside. They expected tunnels, forged papers, and clandestine plots. They completely misjudged the collective psychology and intent of their Japanese prisoners. The concept of a mass suicidal charge, an act not of escape but of self-immolation, was beyond their strategic imagination. There were warning signs, but they were misinterpreted. The prisoners' rigid adherence to military discipline was seen as a positive, a sign of a well-ordered and manageable population. Their refusal to perform certain types of labor was put down to stubbornness, not a deeply held code of honor that forbade aiding the enemy's war effort. Intercepted communications and reports from informants, mostly Korean and Formosan laborers who had been conscripted into the Japanese army, spoke of a growing unrest and a desire to die, but these were often dismissed as hyperbole or fatalistic rhetoric. The camp authorities simply could not fathom that the prisoners meant it literally. On the medical front, the Australian doctors and medics saw the prisoners' stoicism in the face of pain as a sign of incredible toughness. They noted the Japanese soldiers' general reluctance to report illnesses unless they were severe, attributing it to a warrior's grit. They failed to see it for what it was, a manifestation of shame. To admit weakness or sickness was another form of failure. The success of the medical staff in saving lives and healing wounds was, from the Australian perspective, an unqualified success. It was proof of the superiority of their values and the effectiveness of their system. They believed they were slowly winning a battle for hearts and minds, demonstrating that surrender was not the end of the world. They were confident that the provision of food, shelter, and first-rate medical care would eventually quell any lingering fanatical impulses. They believed that rationality would prevail over ideology. This fundamental misreading of their enemy's motivation, seeing a desire for life where there was only a desperate yearning for a meaningful death, would soon have catastrophic consequences. The guns in the watchtowers were pointed outwards to stop men from getting out, not inwards to stop an army from trying to die upon them. August 5, 1944, 2:00 hours. The first sound was not a gunshot but a note, a single clear bugle call played by a former Imperial Japanese Army bugler, sliced through the frigid night air. It was a sound that did not belong in the quiet Australian bush. For the sleeping guards of the 22nd Garrison Battalion, it was a confusing, jarring intrusion. For the 104 Japanese prisoners in Compound B, it was the signal. The night erupted. Hut doors were thrown open, and a torrent of men poured out into the compound. They were not a disorganized mob. They moved with chilling, disciplined fury. They had armed themselves with whatever they could find: baseball bats from the camp's recreation equipment, sharpened mess kits, table legs studded with nails, and garrotes made from wire. Hundreds of men, organized into waves, sprinted towards the fences on the northern and western sides of the compound. Many wore their blankets like cloaks, intending to throw them over the barbed wire to create a crude bridge for those who followed. Privates Ronald Jones and Charles Shepard, two young guards in Tower No. 7, were momentarily frozen in disbelief. Below them, a human tsunami surged towards their position. Shepard was the first to react, chambering a round in his Lee Enfield and firing a warning shot. It had no effect. The wave of men did not slow. It accelerated, accompanied by a terrifying guttural roar. "Banzai!" The cry echoed across the camp, a sound of utter desperation and suicidal intent. The Vickers machine gun in Tower No. 8 opened up, its rhythmic thump-thump-thump spitting a stream of .303 caliber rounds into the charging mass. Men at the front of the charge were cut down, their bodies piling up against the wire, but their comrades simply ran over them, their makeshift cloaks and their very bodies becoming the bridge. The sheer weight and momentum of the men brought down entire sections of the fence. Hundreds poured through the breaches, splitting into two main groups. One group swarmed the main gate, overwhelming the guards. Another group fanned out, their objective not escape but chaos and death. They set fire to the camp's kitchen, the mess halls, and their own huts, the flames lighting up the horrific scene. Sergeant Major Kanazawa was at the heart of the charge towards the western fence. The pain in his leg was a distant, irrelevant sensation. All he felt was a profound sense of release. This was it. This was the moment of purification. He saw the muzzle flash of the Vickers gun, felt the air crackle around him. A man to his left fell without a sound. Another stumbled, clutching his stomach. Kanazawa did not falter. He reached the wire, his hands tearing on the barbs as he helped throw a blanket over the top. He was one of the first over, landing hard on the other side. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not towards the open country, but back towards the fight, towards the sounds of the guns, armed only with a sharpened piece of wood. He was no longer a patient. He was a soldier of the Emperor once more, seeking his final, glorious moment. The Australian guards, jolted from their routines, responded with a mixture of terror and grim professionalism. The battle for Camp 12 was a chaotic, close-quarters affair fought in darkness, illuminated only by the spreading fires and the sweep of searchlights. The prisoners who breached the perimeter did not behave like escapees. They did not flee into the bush. Instead, many turned and attacked the guard posts and machine gun nests with a ferocity that stunned the Australians. They charged directly into the streams of machine gun fire, seemingly oblivious to the bullets tearing them apart. Private Kenji was part of a group that swarmed Tower Number 8. They were cut down in swathes by the Vickers gun, but their sheer numbers were overwhelming. They climbed over the bodies of their fallen comrades, clawing their way up the tower's supports. The gunner, Private Benjamin Hardy, kept firing until the last possible second, his weapon's barrel glowing red. He was killed when the mob finally reached his position. His partner, Private Ralph Jones, was also killed, beaten to death with baseball bats. They had fired nearly 3,000 rounds between them. This was the great, horrific surprise for the Australians. They were prepared to stop an escape. They were not prepared for an enemy whose sole objective was to die in battle. The prisoners' tactics were not designed for survival, but for maximizing the chances of being killed. This fundamentally broke every rule of engagement the guards understood. They were no longer guards containing prisoners. They were soldiers in a desperate battle for their own lives against a force that had no fear of death. As the breakout devolved into a series of frantic, isolated skirmishes across the camp and into the surrounding farmland, another unexpected element of the tragedy unfolded. Within the compound, behind the front lines of the charge, hundreds of prisoners who were too ill or unwilling to participate were taking their own lives. They hanged themselves in the latrines or committed suicide with concealed blades. The ideology of no surrender demanded a final fatal price from everyone.